So while Diane's setting up the slides, I thought I'd just ask you 3 questions to get us started. Who here is actually contributing to an open source project? From a corporate ID? And who here is using an open source product within their environment without any external support, vendor support or anything like that? So, open source. My name, as Diane said, is Duncan Lawie. I'm an infrastructure architect at Credit Suisse. And I'd like to give you a brief, perhaps discouraging view of where open source fits into my example of a financial services company. It's my view that the very fact of software being open source is not itself a differentiator. And I'd like to explain why and perhaps offer some reasons for hope. As with most enterprises, open source is spread throughout Credit Suisse. At least half of you put your hands up on that third question. But then so is commercial software, and so is in-house code. We tend to use whatever is best suited for the situation at hand. And that definition of suitability rarely has anything to do with whether a product is open source. Instead, the choice will be made on the basis of functionality, risk, and reward. So let's start with functionality in terms of cost versus completeness, playing with the new technology, and in the opportunities for reinventing the wheel. Now, most commonly, open source products are used in places like ours because they cost less. And let's start by traveling back in time a little bit. The move from mainframe to Unix, some of you may remember all the way back to that. We still have a mainframe at Credit Suisse. It is still a core part of our environment. But the move from mainframe to Unix wasn't because of licensing exactly. It was because it was possible to buy it in smaller units, to scale based on need, and it was what we actually called in those days an open system, with the interface less dependent on the hardware vendor. I think you may have heard exactly the same kinds of arguments in terms of open source and cloud in recent years. And the move from Solaris to Linux had a similar motivation in the larger enterprise space. It was about running computer systems at lower cost for similar functionality. The move to Linux within the enterprise really only started to scale when there were vendors who banks could trust and deal with. Companies like Red Hat might be founded on an open source philosophy, but they do a lot of business with places like Credit Suisse because they can speak the corporate language. Indeed, on the way to Linux and Intel, we spent significant time and effort working on systems with odd mixtures of commercial and open source components, strange hardware, odd licensing, different vendors, and we made things as complicated as you might imagine. I think we've become better at managing that, but perhaps mostly we've done this because we've made more of our questions a vendor problem. For example, when we started playing with Hadoop, we followed down the open source track to begin with, but we pretty soon started looking at distributions, and then we started narrowing our options. One vendor who we tested was dismissed purely because they couldn't walk the corporate talk. It had nothing to do with the quality of the distribution itself. Now, of course, people across the enterprise are playing with the new toys. Whether it's Kubernetes or Cassandra, SaltStack or Chrome, we do see all these things coming into the enterprise, and from diverse sources. And we are building mechanisms to enable developers to experiment without immediately exposing ourselves to the risk of direct downloads from the internet. And in that sense, perhaps we're using open source as a way of try before you buy. We can play with the software before we make a strategic decision. Now, most major vendors I can think of will give me a trial license to test out their product, but there's almost always a certain amount of friction in getting that. And even before that stage, it's a lot easier to put free and open source software into the hands of the next generation so that they are building up that skill and knowledge long before they can afford to engage with the major enterprise. Another reason to use open software, which becomes more visible at smaller scales than at larger ones. There are very few businesses who see value in building their own operating system or database. But often, development teams find themselves writing a piece of code for which there is a perfectly good open source library. Buying that kind of library is often quite painful, more painful than writing and maintaining it yourself. But if you can download the source and add it into your product for free and with minimal effort, the balance of pain changes. Sometimes even finding out that such a library exists is a matter of serendipity. I wrote a lot of tests in Python before I discovered the unit test module, for example. But open source communities like to share the things they enjoy, whether it's in person like today or online like much of the rest of our week. And that is one of the ways of discovering these things and working out what you want to do with them next. The result is developers can get on with doing a new thing, a business-specific thing, rather than building and maintaining non-differentiating code. So given that we have some reasons, at least, for considering open source, I'd like to turn to risks, primarily licensing, support, and security. Now, when the GPL appeared, we worried a lot about licensing. It looked like a tough nut to crack. And today, we've made that question much more of a vendor problem, as I mentioned earlier. I remember the days of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, when the viral nature of open source licenses meant that corporations felt that they needed to keep clear of these products in case suddenly the proprietary business functionality was exposed to the eyes of the world. Now, some licenses still do worry us a bit, such as the Afro license. Indeed, I tend to see that particular license as a way of getting in the front door on an open source basis, and then encouraging companies to move to an alternate commercial offering so that they have better protection against the remaining viral elements of that particular license. But in most cases, the perceived threat has retreated. There are three key reasons for this. Firstly, there are better commonly shared definitions of what open source means, and many open source projects now pick a package definition off the shelf rather than writing their own license from the ground up. Secondly, the business has built legal expertise. While there is still not a lot of case law in this space, there is a much more general understanding on the part of us as consumers as to what we do and don't get the right to do with software. And thirdly, as I've mentioned a couple of times, business relationships with intermediaries and suppliers of open source give our corporate warriors comfort. But our corporate warriors have other things to consider also. There comes a point in the process where this stuff becomes critical infrastructure. Do we really want to bet the bank on software which has no support contract? Can we, as a large-scale commercial corporation, put ourselves in a position where we don't have a vendor on the other end of the line, whether the phone line or the contract line? Sometimes, perhaps, that contract is a comfort blanket. I've seen how much pressure we need to bring to bear on a commercial vendor when we want to patch the software that isn't on their priority list. Or we see a valuable enhancement to a product, but it's not on the product manager's critical path. Yes, when the product is open source, we could just fix it ourselves. Of course, there are people within our environment who can use and manage open source products. They can understand the documentation when they can find it. They can apply it. Perhaps they can even supply patches. But we tend not to choose to do this because we would rather be having our coders spend their time writing stuff for our own in-house applications. That stuff is part of our business, our intellectual property. And increasingly, the other software, particularly for infrastructure, isn't considered business differentiating. Once upon a time, Credit Suisse actually wrote our own HA solution for Unix, because it met our availability needs better and cheaper than what was available on the market at the time. And what has happened since is that we've got rid of that product completely. We take it from a third-party vendor, whether it's a commercial offering like Veritas or an open source offering like Pacemaker. And we don't wish to employ people for expertise which they rarely need. But when the answer is Slack, Stack Overflow, and a mailing list, then nervousness is going to result. We don't think it's a valid strategy to hope that a bug or an issue is going to be fixed. The organization wants to know what its mitigation strategy is. And that means providing a commercial intermediary who will provide us with insurance. At that point, what does it matter that Linux is an open source product, that Hadoop is Apache Hadoop? When someone from MariaDB sales team tells me that their product is open source, what are they trying to tell me? Perhaps it's the code can't be made proprietary. But even MySQL's ownership by Oracle as a corporation has not actually removed the GPL. Now, to be fair to MariaDB and Postgres, they have structures defined to make sure that they will not be a single company which has a majority share in the software assets. But what difference does that make to me? Perhaps the argument is that I can go somewhere else to get my commercial support for the open source product. But when one support organization has the majority of the support capability, why would I pick a junior player? Indeed, there is a concern that a small vendor couldn't bear the weight of providing critical infrastructure. And compare that with an open source product where there's no commercial supplier at all. Indeed, taking significant amounts of risk of software from such sources might even be seen as poor risk management by our regulators, and we have many regulators. The biggest potential for risk, though, in a bank is on the security of or vulnerabilities with a product. Now, in practice, a spyware Trojan horse may well be more likely to come into the bank in a virus than in an open source program, but there is certainly a danger of dodgy code, particularly when most of us have seen commercial code deliver the wrong results or create security holes. The first open source response may well be the old line that many eyes make bugs shallow. But we can't really rely on that, particularly if the code in question is going to be operating on valuable or private data. The cost of mistakes is high, and the number of suitably qualified eyes might well be very low. And whilst most problems are the result of mistakes, there is also the possibility of bad actors. There is also a very distinct concern about the maintenance effort that we are creating. Yes, it was the latest and best when we obtained it from the repository, but that doesn't stay the case forever. Whilst we might be able to afford not to take the new functionality, some proportion of change in the code base is going to be resolving known issues, whether simple bugs or security vulnerabilities. And there are two failure modes at least here. The first is if the organization isn't actually even watching for updates, the code base is going to get stale. The second is if the development cycle within the organization can't keep up, then the code base is still going to get stale. Finally, in the risk context, and perhaps most critically, there is a significant concern about data safety and leakage of intellectual property, that code which creates our competitive advantage. I've already mentioned the danger of bringing spyware in-house. Equally worrying is the possibility of leaking information when contributing to an open source project. Some of the leakage could seem innocuous, names of internal projects or staff as part of comments or commit information. Next, there's the possibility of hard-coded test data or infrastructure information in the code. Most important, though, is when the code itself is that differentiating intellectual property. I doubt any bank plans to share its high-frequency trading algorithms, at least not on purpose. But unconsidered commits to a public repository can also share information of value to competitors. And that worries our corporate warriors. So with so much to worry about, why would we even consider contributing to open source? Perhaps the most obvious item is something I already mentioned, a faster cycle time. If we can avoid reinventing the wheel, then we can improve the cycle time of our own deliveries. And perhaps we can end up reducing the amount of code that it is our job, the job of our own staff, to maintain. Yes, the code still needs to be maintained, but if we can meet the cycle that external parties work at, that effort is spread much more widely. That puts constructive pressure on the delivery teams inside the bank to act more like the world outside, supporting our desire to move towards an agile and DevOps culture. We can then achieve the cadence of delivery that our business and our customers have come to expect from the digital age. Another benefit is a better tech landscape inside the bank. This applies even when the code we share is not actually open source. Inner source, or internal open source, helps to build a mindset that code could be edited by people in other teams, in other parts of the organization. And therefore, coders need to supply sufficient context when writing code and tests. Equally, improving the code base is no longer so much constrained by the resources of a single team. Perhaps this is easiest to observe in IT for IT, where the results, for example, are used in development pipelines. A pipeline originally defined for Java can be extended to C++ or .NET by different teams with a different set of skills who want to take advantage of the underlying pipeline. The result is a better tech landscape for the whole organization and perhaps even provides training wheels towards full open source contributions. There are other benefits too. As a developer works with and understands a broader code base, he or she builds skills that are transferable to other projects. It also helps to build a network across the bank, perhaps mostly informally, but it can also contribute to communities of practice, or guilds, or whatever the right set of buzzwords is in your organization. There is also a set of benefits for both the individual and the organization in being able to give code back to the open source community. Now, obviously, contributing fixes and improvements to the trunk benefits the open source project itself. Perhaps less obvious is that we create complexity inside the organization when we don't contribute code changes. Many licenses allow us to adjust the code as much as we like if we don't redistribute it. But if we've improved or bug-fixed open source code, then each time we get a new version into the bank, we need to handle our branches. Interestingly, I've heard stories from other organizations who just branched, developed, and began building their own product. When, 2 or 3 years later, they'd worked out how to give back, they discovered their work was effectively redundant. The open source version was already streets ahead, and the best they could do was work out how to dump their own code and go back to trunk. That pain and complexity can be avoided. There is also generally a benefit to the individual developer who can contribute to the public code base. If they do a competent job, it builds their reputation. It's also an opportunity to learn a variety of skills, both technical and in dealing with distributed products, possibly large-scale and global. Transferable skills might sound like a threat to some managers, but that transfer of skills and knowledge can benefit each of us in our day job as well. It can also assist the bank's ability to recruit in 2 different ways. Firstly, it improves the ability of recruiters to learn who on the market has similar skills. Indeed, I recently heard a development lead in an IT company, not a bank, saying that they wouldn't hire anyone who doesn't have a GitHub account. Being able to see what someone has already done is a great way to reduce the amount of technical interviewing necessary, and measuring their reputation in the field becomes a lot simpler. It's not just about who you know down the pub, although that probably still counts quite significantly. Secondly, new starters might well be able to get up to speed more quickly, based on their familiarity with the technology in question. Of course, this is always applied in almost all recruiting. I'm sure there are people here who remember, maybe even have, an MCSE. But actually being familiar with the code base, very unlikely without open source. Interestingly, this is also one of the ways that lagging organizations are being pushed to use more open source. I had a long chat with a developer a few months ago who explained to me how much better it was to use named table references as per the ANSI SQL standard. This is correctly implemented in Postgres, but missing from at least some commercial databases. To conclude, I hope I've shown you that an organization like mine understands that there are rewards from open source, but the fact that a product is open source is highly unlikely to be a critical factor in choosing a product. Whilst we tend to accept that open source means the cost of introduction and consumption will be reduced, it sometimes looks like free as in puppy. For critical software, we will always need a support contract in place. And commercial confidentiality precludes me from telling you some remarkable examples of when a commercial supplier of closed source software has beaten an open source supplier on price. For smaller items, perhaps direct invoice costs are less obvious, but open source projects can go out of fashion as easily as a small vendor can go to the wall. And in all cases, security is paramount. A data breach could lead to a critical loss of trust, whilst unintended sharing of code could lead to a loss of commercial advantage. Despite the benefits, that is the bottom line. Yes, you might well say that the same is true of commercial software, but whatever the source, we have the same risk and cost demands in everything we do. Thank you.